Hello, kiddies. This is the Crypt Keeper, and you're listening to Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. Be careful what you ask for. You may get it.
Hey, campfire crew. Let's get it on. The Side Trail, submitted by Walker John. My name is John, and this happened during the last week of May in 2020. I was 22 years old, finishing my junior year of college, and my girlfriend Skylar and our friend Matt and I decided to celebrate the end of finals by hiking a week-long section of the AT through the mountains of southwestern Virginia. None of us were experienced thru-hikers, but we'd spent plenty of weekends backpacking, and we were confident enough that we could tackle the roughly 70 miles between Damascus and Pearisburg. We planned carefully, packed light, and figured we'd resupply once midway through. But that plan fell apart much faster than we expected. The mistake was embarrassingly simple. We were idiots. We underestimated how much food we'd go through while climbing steep elevation every day. And Matt actually punctured one of our dehydrated meal bags before we even reached the second campsite. By the fourth morning, we were rationing trail mix and peanut butter, and by the fifth afternoon, all we'd had left between the three of us was a handful of crackers and 2 energy gels. We had plenty of water because the springs were reliable, but hiking hungry changes the way you think. I'm not kidding. Every mile feels twice as long, and every decision starts revolving around finding civilization as quickly as possible. We stopped at an overlook where the trail briefly followed a rocky ridge, and Matt unfolded a map. According to him, and what he could read, there was an old forest road that cut west through the tiny community of Ceres, Virginia. If we could find that road, we could probably hitch a ride into town, buy some supplies, and either return to the trail or arrange for transportation back to our starting point. The map showed what looked like a faint connector trail branching off the AT, several miles ahead. It wasn't marked as an official route, but it appeared to head in roughly the right direction. We convinced ourselves it must have been an old access trail. Looking back at it now, hunger probably made the decision for us. The side path wasn't maintained, and at first it looked merely neglected. Knee-high grass growing between faded footprints and falling branches scattered across the route. After about 20 minutes, the forest seemed quieter than anywhere we'd been all week. The usual bird song faded until we could hear nothing except our boots crunching through dead leaves and the occasional groan of trees rubbing together in the wind. Even Matt, who normally talked non-stop, became quiet. The trail narrowed until it was barely more than a depression winding through the dense foliage. Every so often we'd pass evidence that someone had walked there before us. An old candy wrapper, a rusted soup can, a faded length of orange survey tape even hung from a branch. But we all noticed that none of it looked like it was recent. It felt less like following a shortcut and more like retracing something the forest had spent years trying to get rid of. Nearly an hour after leaving the AT, the trees opened into a clearing that couldn't have been more than a half an acre across. Sitting near the center was this old wooden shack leaning to one side. The roof was sagging in the middle, boards were missing from the walls, and weeds had grown almost waist-high around its foundation. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. Matt said something like, I guess somebody was out here hunting at one point in time. We had stopped walking, and Skylar said, I really don't want to stop, guys. Neither did I. There was something about this clearing that made me want to keep moving. I mean, it wasn't dramatic or anything obvious. It just felt off. There weren't any birds flying overhead, we didn't hear any insects buzzing around through the tall grass, and even the breeze that had followed us all day seemed to just kind of disappear inside that clearing. So we made our way for the opposite tree line, intending to pass the shack without getting any closer than necessary. And that's when I saw the boot. It was lying on its side about 10 feet off the trail, and at first I thought someone had just lost it years ago because the leather was cracked and dirty. But when I walked closer, I noticed what I thought was mud were actually dark stains covering the toe and laces. There was dried blood caked along one side. It wasn't mud. I stopped so suddenly that Skylar bumped into me, and she said, "What? Why'd you stop?" And I pointed. We all stared at it for several seconds before Matt said, "Dude, that's blood." The boot was an expensive brand, the kind only serious backpackers wear for long-distance hiking. I'm not going to say the brand here. One lace had snapped completely, and the tongue was folded outward as though someone had pulled their boot from it in a hurry. Skylar slowly turned her head away from the boot and just kind of said, "John." About 20 yards farther ahead, partially hidden beneath a fallen pine limb, was a trekking pole. One of the handles was smeared with dried reddish-brown stains that matched what was on the boot. More blood. It wasn't lying across the path like it had been dropped accidentally. It kind of seemed like it was pointing off toward the shack. The three of us looked at one another, and we didn't have to say anything. Every logical explanation felt incomplete. Someone could have been injured, certainly, but why leave behind one boot and one trekking pole? And why right here, on an abandoned path miles from the nearest maintained trail? As we looked at the shack, I finally said, "Maybe we should check this out." As we approached the shack, every sound we made seemed really, really loud. The dry grass brushed against our pants with a scratchy hiss, and our packs creaked. My own breathing sounded embarrassingly heavy inside my ears. As we got up to it, we could see that the front door was hanging crooked on one hinge. I tapped it with my trekking pole before stepping inside, and the smell hit me immediately. It wasn't anything identifiable or really terrible. It was just years of damp wood, mold, and stale earth. Sunlight filtered through the missing boards, and you could see that there wasn't much inside. A filthy mattress lay against one wall, and there were some rusted cans and broken glass bottles scattered across the floor. Someone had built crude shelves once that had long since collapsed. It just looked like every abandoned hunting shack I'd ever seen, except this one just seemed emptier. There were no clothes, no sleeping bags, no signs that anyone had lived there recently. Matt was kind of poking around in the corners when I looked behind the mattress and didn't find anything. Out loud, he said, "I don't get this." Neither did I. Then Skylar froze. Her head tilted towards the woods behind the shack, and she said, "You guys hear that?" Matt and I stopped moving, and I said, "Heard what?" She said, "A scream." Neither of us answered, but she insisted. It was a scream. It was really far away, but it was a scream like someone yelling. I stood there listening until I felt like my ears actually hurt. There was nothing. As I mentioned, no birds, no insects, no voices, no footsteps. Just silence. Matt finally said aloud, "I didn't hear anything." And Skylar said, "I swear I did." And I believed that she believed it. Skylar had her head on right and wasn't someone who imagined things for attention. And the expression on her face wasn't panic so much as confusion. She had that look of someone trying to understand whether she'd actually heard something or only thought she had. We went outside again, and I looked around the surrounding woods. There wasn't a single visible trail leading away from the clearing, and I remember thinking that if someone had been standing 50 yards inside those trees watching us, we never would have known. And that thought stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. We decided there was nothing else we could do. No cell service, couldn't call anyone, and wandering deeper into unfamiliar forest searching for a sound only one of us had heard seemed like the worst possible decision we could possibly make. So we kept walking. The path eventually widened until it intersected a gravel forest road almost 2 hours later. And honestly, I should have felt relieved. Instead, I had this feeling that whatever had occupied my thoughts since leaving that clearing hadn't stayed behind. It wasn't exactly fear, it was just this uncomfortable certainty that something was very aware of us. I caught myself glancing back over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting to see someone standing on the edge of the road, but there never was. But even so, none of us spoke much until we reached pavement. A passing pickup truck stopped after only a few minutes, and an older man driving gave us a ride into Ceres without asking any questions. We thanked him, bought enough food to finish the hike, and before checking into a small motel for the night, we walked over to a sheriff's outpost office. He was in and listened patiently while we explained everything that we'd seen. The abandoned trail, the shack, the bloody boot, and trekking pole, and Skylar hearing what sounded like a scream. He asked us where we'd left the AT, and then wrote several notes on a legal pad. When we finished, he just leaned back in his chair and took a good look at us and said, "All right, I'll look into it." And that was it. I expected more questions. But he simply reminded us to stay on marked trails and wished us luck finishing our hike, and then he walked us out. His reaction bothered me almost as much as what we'd found. I mean, this guy didn't seem surprised by this at all. 3 days later, we completed the hike without another unusual incident. Once I got home, curiosity turned into an obsession. I searched every missing persons database I could find. I looked through local newspaper archives and hiking forums, Facebook groups, and even county sheriff press releases. There was no mention of this anywhere. No missing backpackers, no reported assaults. There was no search and rescue operations anywhere near where we'd been. I even called the sheriff's office once about a month later, pretending I wanted to know whether the property owner had been contacted. But the person who answered the phone transferred me twice before someone politely told me there was nothing they could share. And that was the end of it, or at least it should have been. The three of us still talk about that hike every few months. Time has blurred most of the trip into ordinary backpacking memories. You know, the rainy campsites, your sore feet, the amazing views that the AT gives you. But that clearing remains perfectly clear. We all remember the same boot, the trekking pole, the mattress in that shack, and that overwhelming feeling that we weren't alone out there. The only detail that differs is Skylar's scream. She's never changed her story. She says it wasn't loud or dramatic, and it wasn't the kind of scream people make in movies. She described it as a single distant cry that stopped almost as soon as it began. So faint, she nearly convinced herself she'd imagined it. Matt and I still tell her that we never heard anything. She just nods at us, and she says the exact same thing every time. I think whoever made that sound knew we were close. I have no idea what happened out there. Maybe there's a perfectly ordinary explanation that never became public. Maybe someone had been injured weeks earlier, and what we found had nothing to do with anything sinister. Maybe that sheriff did investigate. Maybe he even found the owner of the boot, and the mystery quietly disappeared. I'd really like to believe that version. But there are two things that still bother me. The first is that the boot and the trekking pole were weathered enough to have been lying there for quite a while. The blood on both of them was completely dry, so whatever happened to whoever owned them hadn't happened that afternoon. We could have been looking at the leftovers of something that had happened months earlier, perhaps longer. The second thing is something Skylar didn't tell us until almost a year after that hike. We were sitting around my apartment one night talking about old trips, when she suddenly asked me if I remembered where I'd been standing when she heard the scream. I said, yeah, I think so. I'd been near the shack, near the corner of the building, looking toward the tree line. Matt was several feet behind me, and Skylar had been standing inside the doorway. But she shook her head. That's not what I remember, she said. I thought she was joking, but she wasn't. She said she'd been standing inside the shack when she heard the sound, and she immediately looked toward the back wall because she thought the scream had come from outside. Then she looked through one of the gaps between the boards. And according to her, that's when she saw something that neither Matt nor I ever heard about. She said there was another trail behind the shack. Not a proper trail, but a narrow path through the weeds and trees, almost completely hidden from where we'd approached. She said it continued straight into the woods, and for several seconds, she could see what looked like footprints pressed into the dirt. She didn't mention it at the time because she was already frightened and she didn't want us going back there. I asked her why she'd waited nearly a year to tell us that. She said she'd been afraid that she'd think she'd imagined that too. I asked her if she'd seen anybody, and she looked at me for a second or two before saying, "No, that's the problem." She said the footprints weren't coming toward the shack. They were going away from it. There had been a series of them in the mud, one after another, leading from somewhere behind the shack toward the tree line. Then they just stopped. I asked her how far the footprints went, and she said maybe 30 or 40 yards. And then she remembered something else. The scream she heard hadn't come from deep in the woods. She'd been wrong about that. It sounded distant because of how faint it was, but now she believed it had actually come from somewhere much closer. At one point, she'd almost convinced herself it had come from inside the shack. That was the first time I thought about the mattress, that old piece of shit that we barely looked at. I remembered the way it had been pushed against the wall, and I remember lifting one corner because I thought there might be something underneath it, and as I've mentioned, there wasn't. At least, nothing I had seen. I told Skylar that night there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe she heard an animal. Maybe the sound had come from the woods and echoed strangely. Maybe the footprints had belonged to whoever had used the shack earlier. Maybe the boot and trekking pole were unrelated to everything else. She agreed, but none of us sounded convinced. A few weeks later, I found the old map we used on that trip. I still had it because I'd written notes all over the margins. So I picked it up and unfolded it on my kitchen table and found the place where we'd left the AT. Then I traced the route we'd taken towards Ceres, and that's when I noticed something I'd missed before. The path we'd followed wasn't marked as a trail. It wasn't even marked as an old forest road. It was nothing more than a faint line that ended several hundred yards before the shack. There was no road beyond it. No connector, no route to Ceres. We hadn't taken a shortcut to a road. We'd simply followed an unmarked path into the woods and eventually happened to reach a gravel road. I called Matt immediately, and he pulled out his copy of the map while we talked, and he found the same thing. Then Matt said something that made me go cold. "John, do you remember the guy who picked us up?" And of course I remember the old man in the pickup. So I said, "Yeah." "Do you remember anything that he said?" And I said, "No, but he did. He said the man had asked us where we'd come from, and Matt just answered that we'd been hiking. The man had looked at the three of us for a moment and asked, 'From which direction, son?' And Matt had pointed back towards the woods. And after that, the man didn't say anything. At the time, Matt thought he was just curious about where we'd been. But now I wonder if that wasn't what he was asking at all. I haven't been back to the AT, and neither has Skylar. Matt said he would go out there again if I asked him to, but I know he won't. None of us have ever found a report of a missing hiker or an injured person or any kind of crime that might explain the boot and trekking pole. And finally, I'll wrap this thing up. One more thing I can't explain. About 2 years after the hike, Skylar sent me a photograph. It was a picture of the three of us standing beside the Appalachian Trail sign before we left the marked path. She'd taken it on her, and I remember the moment clearly because we'd been laughing about how hungry we were. She'd zoomed in on the background, and behind us, maybe 100 yards away through the trees, was the beginning of the side trail we'd followed. Standing beside it was a person. For the longest time, I thought it was just a tree trunk, but when I enlarged the picture in Photoshop, it wasn't. It was someone standing perfectly still between the trees, facing us. I couldn't make out any face or clothes distinctly. It was too far away, and partially obscured by branches, but there was definitely something there that hadn't been visible to any of us when the photograph was taken. Skylar asked me if I thought it was the person who'd been watching us. I told her I didn't know. But then she said, "Look where it's standing." And I did. The figure wasn't standing on the trail. It was standing just off of it, facing the camera. I know I still have that photograph, but I've moved since, and I've looked for it a dozen times, and just can't seem to find it right now. But when I think about it, I've never been able to decide whether I was looking at a person or simply seeing a pattern in the trees. And I remember the first time that I scrutinized it, I thought I noticed something about it, something that it was holding. Maybe something like a trekking pole, or that was just my imagination. I don't know what we ran into that day we were out there, and I don't know what Skylar heard. We obviously don't know who owned the boot, and why there was blood on the trekking pole, or why someone had apparently walked away from the shack without leaving a continuous trail behind them. Once in a while I'll think about what that sheriff said when we finished telling him what we'd found. Yeah, I'll look into it. He didn't ask us to show him the location where we'd found what we did. He never asked for our names, and he didn't ask whether we'd actually seen anybody. He just told us to stay safe. And I've wondered ever since if that was because he already knew exactly what was out there. Thanks for reading this if you do, Uncle Josh. Sorry about the length. My Skinwalker Experience Outside of a Navajo Reservation by Cranberry Free. The year was 2010, and I was driving back to Los Angeles after Christmas break. I-40 all the way. I ended up getting tired and decided to pull off at the next exit to find a hotel room. This was in Holbrook, Arizona, about 40 or 45 minutes east of Flagstaff. I was taking I-40 the whole way. Little did I know, Holbrook was right on the edge of a Navajo reservation. Anyway, I paid for my hotel room, parked around back, and went to unload my car for food and snacks I'd need for the night. Where I was parked, there was a parking lot about 10 feet above where my car was. I was going about my business, getting together food and everything, when I heard this roar that sent my blood cold. I looked up at the raised parking lot I was parked in front of, and there, standing, was what I can only describe as a 7 or 8 foot creature with a dog's head and a person's body. It roared again, and I took off running to my room. As I was fumbling around with the key card trying to get it in the slot, it roared again, and this time sounding like it was right next to me. I finally got the door open, locked it, took all the sheets and pillows off the bed and put them in the bathtub, and locked that door behind me too. I ended up spending the night in the bathtub, so I'd at least have 2 locked doors between whatever the hell I saw out there and where I was sleeping inside. I spent the night looking at what could have been roaring at me. I hadn't even heard of skinwalkers at that point, and figured out that's probably what it was. One of the most incredible things to me, anyway, was that when I saw it and ran for my room, I left my Toyota Highlander wide open. I mean, all 4 doors open, all the lights on inside, and no one took anything from it. I had thousands of dollars of music equipment in my car, and not one thing was touched or stolen. Someone could have cleaned me out completely and left me with nothing at all, but no one touched a thing. I'll never forget the sound that thing made. It was like the roar of a bear mixed with a pig squealing. I got out of there around 5 a.m. when the sun was coming up and had to wait in line because there was already a pretty big line out front filled with people waiting for them to open so they could get liquor. I got talking to a guy who was behind me, just about random stuff, and I couldn't help bring up what had happened the night before. He just laughed and said, I quote, "Huh, usually they don't mess with white people." Then he laughed. Well, that's my Skinwalker story. Not completely sure it wasn't some tweaker dressed up as something creepy, but my asshole was clenched, no doubt. I've made the drive about 20 more times since, and I always make sure I make it to Flagstaff before I stop for a hotel room. For those that are still listening to this, thank you. I still have no idea what that thing was, but I was on the edge of a Navajo reservation, so a skinwalker would make sense. Weird Experience on Mount Tamalpais by West Investment. I've lived in the San Francisco Bay Area all my life, and have frequently taken advantage of all the hiking, camping, sailing, and other outdoor activities people in this region commonly enjoy year-round. Typically, I'll just get a motel room somewhere and hike all day before returning to sleep in whatever small town I'm staying in. This wasn't true backcountry hiking, but a week ago I drove to Stinson Beach and got a motel room for 2 nights. I booked a Monday-Tuesday knowing the trails wouldn't be busy. My plan was to do a few basic and popular hikes, sections of Bolinas Ridge and Dipsea Steep Ravine, before setting out supper early one morning with the intention of heading deeper into Mount Tam State Park than I'd ever been before. In order to get the quickest possible start up the mountain, I took a shortcut up an extremely steep fire road behind the last row of houses on the hillside in Stinson, Willow Camp Fire Road. I don't recommend it. My legs were on fire by the end. But it eventually intersected with the coastal trail. From there, I wanted to get to Bolinas Ridge and put some miles in before turning around and heading back down Matt Davis Trail. After ascending about 2 miles up what turned out to be a nearly vertical grade in direct sunlight, I'm such an idiot, I entered a cool forested area, which was initially a relief. On the fire road, I'd had my AirPods in listening to some bullshit podcast to distract myself from the insane verticality of the ascent. I figured it was fine because it wasn't really even wilderness, just a fire road behind a town. Once I hit the forest, I took my AirPods out to maintain better situational awareness and to enjoy the solitude of nature. Immediately, I felt uneasy. The forest was very dark and misty due to the fog from the marine layer. This is very beautiful and not at all atypical, but this feeling of nervousness in what is frankly not a very remote area was new. I can't ever recall feeling this panic for no reason in the woods. There was absolutely no bird song or wind. I immediately thought about bears, mountain lions, etc. that could cause the woods to fall silent, which is typically where my mind goes when hiking, not to a supernatural entity of any kind. I kept my head on a swivel as I moved through the wooded section, and I could see that further up the hillside there was another clearing. I moved quickly toward it, and in my haste I almost put my foot through a beehive that had fallen smack dab in the middle of the trail. After freaking out a little, I realized that the beehive wasn't active, and this was a really cool find, so I crouched down to look at it. There were a few larger pieces of honeycomb next to it that were well preserved and dry, so I put a small piece in my backpack as a souvenir. While doing so, still crouched on the ground, all the hairs on my neck stood up, and I stopped mid-task to look up into the woods. There was a person about 15 feet away from me standing partially obscured behind a tree. I was so startled that I yelled out, "Oh shit!" and I stood up quickly. The person didn't move. I looked closer and saw that it was very clearly a Native American, shirtless from the waist up with a white beaded necklace and long dark hair. I even waved awkwardly and laughed a little. I mean, that's how real this person looked. As soon as I waved, they disappeared. Okay, sure. I stood there feeling confused and kind of embarrassed. At this point, I generally wasn't sure whether my eyes were playing tricks on me or what. I couldn't see the person's face, which was obscured in the shadow of the tree, and I didn't hear any footsteps coming or going. My mind was racing like, what is going on? Was this a random drifter from the beach that maybe my mind confused for an indigenous person because they were shirtless and had long black hair? The thought of that embarrassed me, that I was projecting weird racial stereotypes onto strangers. It kept me grounded, but there was another feeling in the back of my mind that kept telling me it was something else. I don't know how to describe how sure I was that it was a Native American man. Just instantly, upon seeing them, I felt so certain that it was. I kept walking with the goal of getting to the clearing and hitting the main trail, which was more exposed to the open air out of the dense forest with good visibility. For the next mile, I kept getting that feeling of panic, then looking into the distance to the left or right and seeing this person. It was the same person every time. just standing stock still in the woods on different sides of the trail. I couldn't see his face, and he didn't make a sound, and I just kept walking faster and faster, in tears and quietly gasping, worried that I was being stalked, or that I was about to be attacked out here alone, or that I was losing my mind completely. I saw him 3 additional times after the first encounter. I didn't see a single other hiker the entire 2 hours I was on the mountain. And to be clear, this is a very popular network of trails and is nowhere near a reservation or any indigenous community. Once I saw the yellow grass through the trees that signified the beginning of the coastal trail, I straight up booked it and went crashing through the woods to get into the open. As soon as my feet hit the trail, I looked down, and again, right in the dead center of the trail, there was a dead mouse. Its guts were laid out around it like it had been smashed by something heavy from above. And I cut my hike short and went the opposite way back to Stinson Beach. No more encounters with that person, but I was so freaked out, I basically ran back to town. Has anyone else ever experienced anything like this? Such a weird hike. My Tree Fort Story, submitted by Derek V. This was the summer of 2016, right outside of Hebron, Pennsylvania, back when my best friend Lance and I were 16. My parents owned a decent patch of land out there, but past the far edge of our lawn lay hundreds of acres of dense, unbroken state game land. On the edge of those woods, roughly a half-mile behind our house, sat the tree fort that my dad and I had built years prior, anchored high up between 3 massive oaks right on the dividing line between our property and that public forest. It was a very sturdy structure with heavy plywood walls, real plexiglass windows, a thick trapdoor, and a roof that kept out the worst of the summer storms. It was the ultimate hideout for 2 teenagers looking to escape adult eyes. On this particular Friday night, the 2 of us had snuck out a 6-pack of warm Bud Light from my garage, and a brand new pack of cheap cigarettes we'd stolen from my grandmother. Yeah, I was a real classy guy back then. We were figuring on a night of having a couple of beers and some smokes with absolutely no one else around. So to keep my parents off our backs and appease my father's strict safety rules, we brought along one of our heavy-duty Motorola walkie-talkies, while leaving the matching base unit sitting on the kitchen counter back at the house, ensuring we had a direct line of communication if we ran into trouble or my parents needed us. By 11 o'clock, we were sitting on old folding lawn chairs inside our fort, listening to a radio, just enjoying the night. We were feeling pretty invincible, taking turns leaning out the window frames to blow smoke into the darkness, and enjoying that sweet freedom of being completely alone right by the edge of the woods. Right around midnight, though, the ambient sounds of the night began to shift in a way that immediately made the hair on my arms stand up. The crickets that had been making noise all night suddenly went silent, and we both heard a rhythmic stepping going through the dense underbrush at the edge of the tree line. Lance reached over and clicked off the radio, and now everything was dead silent. We just sat there listening to whatever was out there that was taking slow and deliberate steps towards our tree fort. At first, we naturally tried to rationalize the sound, whispering back and forth about whether it might just be a stray buck or a black bear wandering through the brush. But the sheer weight of the impacts felt entirely wrong for any common 4-legged animal. The footsteps were heavy and distinctly bipedal, making the damp earth vibrate slightly as whatever was making them getting closer and closer to the base of our shelter. And that's when we heard the voices. That's the best way I could describe it. They were unnatural voices, though. It was not a bear's growl or the grunt of an animal, but this raspy string of gibberish, like 2 distinct entities trying to talk to each other or communicate in a strange dialect. Honestly, it was like a bunch of wet clicks and low murmurs that were far too deep to belong to any human being. The voices, or whatever they were totally creeping us out. But Lance and I crept towards the small plexiglass window and looked outside into the darkness. Through it, we watched in disbelief as two incredibly large bipedal creatures stepped out from behind the tree trunks on the tree line and stopped near the base of our fort. They were huge, easily 8 feet tall. We were 12 feet off the ground, and I know if they had raised up their arms, they probably could have touched the bottom of the tree fort. As best we could see, they were covered from head to toe in thick matted hair, and Lance, who was a little saucier than me, made the stupid decision to reach for his mag light and then flicked a beam directly on the two figures below us. The light shone over their faces, and all I remember was seeing deep-set eyes that were yellow, and they immediately let out a terrible, ear-splitting howl that rattled the entire tree fort. That's before they stopped screaming and took off back into the state game land. The quiet returned, and we were both shit scared just sitting there in the dark. Just as we began to convince ourselves that the danger had passed, the entire tree fort lurched violently to one side as something massive slammed directly into the main trunk of the oak keeping us up. Before we could even process what was happening, the entire structure shook uncontrollably, back and forth, as if something was down there shaking the shit out of the tree. More of those howls came out of nowhere in the darkness all around us, and was followed by a bunch of really creepy shrieks. So, in my panic, I scrambled across the floor, grabbed the Motorola, and yelled into the microphone with everything I had in me for my dad to come help us, that something was attacking us. The shaking and screams kept up for a couple of more minutes, and we thought we were gonna die. And then out of nowhere, we heard the crack of a high-powered rifle. It was my dad. Then we heard a second loud blast that shattered the night air. The trees stopped shaking and the howls stopped too. We heard two giant bodies tearing through the brush as they went back into the state land. A minute or so later, we saw a flashlight beam bouncing through the fields coming towards us, and the next thing we knew, my dad was in the tree fort with us. He listened intently with what we told him, looking us dead in the eye and admitting that he had seen the exact same thing creeping around the edge of the forest as he'd run up with his rifle. He told us that we needed to get back into the house, and of course his flashlight caught the empty beer cans on the floor, but instead of blowing his top or punishing us, he just looked at us dead in the eye and said, "Don't ever do it again." But he also said something else that surprised me. He warned us to never mention a word of this to our mothers, and to let the whole thing go. To this day, whenever the subject gets brought up or someone even hints at what happened out that night in 2016, my dad immediately shuts the conversation down and tells everybody to knock it off. He never engages it at all. He once even pulled me aside and privately explained that he never wanted anyone else in our house to be frightened by what actually happened out there, especially not my mom or my sisters. I never saw those creatures again after that, and I never really went back into the state land alone. I remain convinced, though, that what we encountered at the edge of the state game land in Pennsylvania was a pair of genuine Bigfoots.
Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you heard and saw, why not give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, leave a comment. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. It's all free and it all helps out with the algorithms, so I appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, and consider getting some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything: a ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.